Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to DCJ's daily press conference. And today we're going to be talking about how agribusiness cannot lead a food systems transformation. There can be no path to 1.5 degrees without a transformation of our food systems. And at long last, this is finally at the forefront of the COP28 narrative. But what does this transformation actually look like? That's a sticking point, isn't it? Because there's an enormous gulf between the desire for ever-expanding profits of the global food and finance corporations and the rights, needs, and demands of small-scale food producers and those countries and peoples most affected by food insecurity. The Emirates Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems, and Climate Action was signed by 134 governments. It asserts that food systems and agriculture need to be at the center of actions of COP28. However, the initiatives that we are seeing now are greatly influenced by the hundreds of multinational agribusinesses that are roaming the corridors of this very venue. Millions of dollars have been pledged to finance corporate technologies and to further entrench the dominance of polluting corporations and factory farming in the global food system. The steering committee of the COP28 Regenerative Landscapes flagship initiative is composed mostly of top executives of international agribusiness. They push regenerative approaches to offset their emissions through soil carbon markets and push sustainable intensification technologies. Small-scale producers feed about 70% of humanity while using a fraction of the Earth's resources. Many of them practice and demand public support for agroecology as a pathway to justice and to care for the earth while feeding the world. I'm Chithira Vijayakumar from the Global Forest Coalition, and today, to discuss all of this and more, and what needs to be done to ensure that we move away from the current flawed industrial agricultural model towards agroecology, we have 4 incredible speakers. Each of them will speak for about 3 minutes, and then I will cut them off. And then we'd like to hear from you, the audience. We'll begin with you, Arnold Padilla, Food Sovereignty Program Coordinator, Pan-Asia Pacific.
Thank you. I also represent here the Global People's Caravan for Food, Land, and Climate Justice, a rural people's movement led from the Global South campaigning for radical food systems transformation. The UAE presidency made sure to hype COP28 as the COP that will put food systems transformation high on the agenda. But what we have seen so far that is high on the agenda of COP28 is the corporate agenda in the food systems. Not the agenda of small food producers, not the agenda of indigenous food systems, certainly not the agenda of the rural peoples who feed the world but suffer the worst hunger and the worst impacts of the climate crisis. We have seen the Emirates Declaration on Agriculture, Food, and Climate that will be implemented to the tune of $2.5 billion by corporate-controlled institutions like the Gates Foundation that will be implemented by a club of over 200 big multinational corporations called the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, that will be implemented by a global consulting firm whose clients include some of the world's largest oil and gas companies. And this declaration even reaffirmed the World Trade Organization, which has for decades caused the massive destruction of food systems and livelihoods of small farmers in the Global South. We have seen the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, led by multinationals in the agri-food industry like Nestle, Unilever, Pepsi, among others, launch their action agenda that claim to improve the livelihoods of small farmers and contribute to climate action. In reality, this action agenda will lock up 160 million hectares of farms and 3.6 million farmers in the Global South to the exploitative supply chain of agribusiness and food giants. It is unacceptable that the lobbyists of big corporate agriculture continue to dominate and distort the narrative of food systems transformation. They repeatedly highlight how agriculture contributes 1/3 to global greenhouse gas emissions, while conveniently ignoring the fact that this is due to the profit-driven and intensive industrial farming that big corporations perpetuate. Food emissions in the Global South account for 38% of our emissions. But this agriculture is not even our agriculture, but the agriculture of multinationals from the Global North operating in the Global South. Worse, these same corporate interests use the climate crisis to promote false solutions that will allow them to sell more of their commodities, including hazardous agrochemicals that poison our planet and destroy its natural capacity to regulate global warming. When in fact, rural communities possess vast knowledge and experience in agri-food production that could genuinely tackle the climate crisis. Many rural communities from the Global South embrace agroecological farming practices that do not recklessly plunder the planet, unlike the market-oriented big corporate model. And even science affirms this, with the IPCC itself saying that agroecological farming could cut emissions by an equivalent of 10% of global energy-related emissions. So we say enough. There should be space for rural peoples, for our aspirations, for our experiences, and our practices to shape the climate agenda, not the agenda of big corporate powers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnold, for setting the stage for us. We'll get back to you, of course, when there's question and answer session. Now we're going to move on to Kelly Dent, the Global Head of External Engagement, World Animal Protection. Take it away.
Thank you. Can people hear me okay? Great. So consider this, a staggering 80 billion land-based animals, the majority of which are confined within industrial farms, are contributing significantly to the climate crisis that we face. Our food system in its current state is responsible for 21 to 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this puts the 1.5 degree temperature target of the Paris Agreement out of reach. To help avoid further damage to the climate, we need nothing less than a transformation, a total transformation, and this has been spoken about already, of our food system. And what this means is that animal agriculture, intensive animal industrial agriculture, or factory farming, as it's called, commonly called, is responsible for at least 11% of global emissions. This is according to a report that World Animal Protection released at this COP, also must be addressed. This factory farming system relies on a global trade in grain to feed animals. The system spews out emissions, it destroys habitats, it contributes to antimicrobial resistance and to hunger and malnutrition. It also condemns billions of farmed animals and wild animals to lives of suffering. The majority of these emissions are from factory farms in the global north. So of that 11%, 34 countries make up 4.3% of these emissions. So this is in the global north. Yet nowhere in these negotiations are we seeing the emissions from factory farming being tackled. So to address the culpability of factory farms for climate damage, we're calling on governments at this COP to impose a 10-year moratorium on new factory farm approvals so that we can halt this very flawed system's rapid global expansion. Intensive animal agriculture is impacting on small-scale producers who contribute to the livelihoods, as we've heard, of 1.7 billion people. 70% of smallholder producers are women. Yet, in terms of finance flows, in terms of adaptation flows, in terms of mitigation, they receive a paltry 0.3% of finance flows. I actually thought it was 1%, and it depends on which study you look at, but it's actually around 0.3%. Big agribusiness companies have borrowed tactics from fossil fuel giants, and they're unleashing their full force at this COP. Predictable as this may be, we cannot afford to allow them to hijack policy spaces. True systems transformation must put smallholder farmers at the forefront and must acknowledge them as the true custodians of our land and of our nature. At the moment, government subsidies and incentives and finance from international financial institutions, they are encouraging unhealthy food choices. They are encouraging trade in unhealthy food commodities and environmentally damaging farming practices. We need to see these subsidies redirected to humane and sustainable food systems, including small-scale producers and agroecological approaches. The most disproportionate impacts of climate-induced weather disasters, as we know, are felt most by the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the global south, countries that do the least to contribute to emissions. We want to see a polluter pays principle applied to the big agribusinesses that are causing this damage, and we want them responsible for the damage that they are causing through their business practices and to climate-related weather events in the global north. So we want them to pay. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you particularly for sharing those damning numbers, 0.3%. Yeah? We're going to move on quickly to Wali Haider, Joint Director, Roots of Equity, Pakistan, to hear from you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. Thanks, friends, for joining us. How these policies, these top-down policies are having trickle-down effect to communities in the south, especially. In Pakistan, I just have to share a case study from the corporate capture in dairy and livestock sector. Pakistan is the 4th largest country in the world in milk production, and it's honored to due to small and landless farmer who contributes 97% of the country's milk production. Livestock accounts for about 60% of the agriculture sector and contributes 11% to the country's output. However, Under the guises of free trade and neoliberal policies, imperialist power are being provided space to grab our precious, invaluable assets. The control of small and landless farmers in Pakistan over the milk and milk-related market is highly resistant to multinational corporations and are using a range of tactics to take control over the dairy and livestock sector. There are two provinces, the Punjab and Sindh. They have established pure food law authority, issued pure food law regulation in 2018, based on which the Punjab food law government is imposing a complete ban on fresh milk sale. Based on new regulation, only pasteurized milk can be sold commercially in the market. In addition, all entities, including farmers who are connected to dairy production, have to register with the Pure Food Law Authority. In short, the Pure Food Law Regulation 2018 are subjected to WTO agreements. Unregistered entities will not allowed to operate in market. These rules are made keeping in mind the sanitary and phytosanitary measures agreement and technical barrier to trade under WTO that had been pushed by mega corporations. No doubt these regulations allow them easy access to local market. On the other hand, there are millions of small and landless farmer families whose livelihood depend on milk production, given no space. In the context of the dairy and livestock sector, the powerful government of the United States, Germany, France, and Australia, and other capitalist industrial countries have agriculture policies, such as Common Agriculture Policy, CAP, and European Union and the US Farm Bill policy. These policies provide billions of dollars and euros to their farmers in production as well as exports. In the 2023 to 2027 CAP policy, and the EU provided 307 billion euros, and US Farm Bill from 2018 to 2023 provided 428 US billion in support to their farmer. Special subsidies are provided to milk sector for shortage of surplus milk and incentive for government procurement of surplus dairy product, as consumption is less than production. Companies convert milk into dairy milk, dry milk or skimmed milk, and then find market for their products. In addition, companies from the US, EU, and Australia specialize in bovine genetic breeding of high-yielding cattle, of cow and buffaloes, which means they want to gain market for their live cattle as well as industrial production of milk is destructive to the environmental and is also cause of global warming. PKMT therefore opposed the imperialistic corporate takeover to our natural resources. Pakistan Kisan Mazdoor Tehreek is determined to defeat such imperialistic policies. We have lost our natural seed to anti-people, anti-farmer, anti-environmental, hybrid and genetic seed. No longer we will let our traditional precious animal to go waste. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wali, for actually grounding these concepts and for that powerful declaration that we are not backing down. And finally, we have Kirtana Chandrasekaran, the Food Sovereignty International Program Coordinator from Friends of the Earth International. Take it away.
Thank you, Chithira. Yeah, and thanks to all of you for those really powerful, I think, testimonies of the different impacts of the food system. So we can see at this COP that the term food systems gets bandied about very often. There are several food systems pavilions. The Emirates Declaration claimed it was talking about food systems. But actually, what we have in the world is a tale of two food systems. One is not really a system, it's a chain that perpetuates a system of oppression. when what we can see is that that is the system that has created 62 new food billionaires during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fertilizer companies, the biggest one in the world, tripled its profits during the pandemic while producing less, receiving several government subsidies. Commodity traders paid record dividends during the COVID-19 crisis, while an additional several hundred million were pushed into hunger. We saw factory farm workers being forced to go into work during the COVID-19 pandemic, while at the same time, millions of pigs and chickens were being culled in the most brutal way because the food chain failed, and it fails every single day. Meanwhile, of course, we know that almost all of our fertilizers are produced by fossil fuels. About 30% of energy consumption is for the industrial food system. And as a result, fertilizers have become a climate bomb. One of our members in France just published an account that almost 1/4 of their agriculture sector's greenhouse gas emissions are from fertilizers. And of course, 1/3 of food systems emissions are from land use change. And the term land use change really hides what they are, which is deforestation and degradation of soils from large agro-commodity producers who produce commodities for profit, not to feed people, and which is linked to a huge history of plantation-based colonialism, which is perpetuated today by these agribusinesses, who are also consistently at the top of the ranks of those corporations that are implicated in criminalization and killing of human rights defenders across the global south. But there's another system. The small-scale food producer system, which is peasants, artisanal fishers, indigenous people, pastoralists. There are millions of them, billions of pastoralists. They produce 70% of the food that people eat, especially in marginalized communities where the food chain doesn't reach and doesn't care to reach. They form almost half of the world's people. They operate on several hundred million small farms. They breed and nurture 8,000 different breeds of livestock. They've donated about 1.9 million plant varieties to the world's gene banks. They're really the caretakers of our food system and the people who feed the world. So that is very clear. And the question is, of course, which food system do people mean when they talk about food systems here at the COP? And as my colleague Arnold said, what we have seen here in terms of the announcements is pretty alarming, where we have the Gates Foundation pledging 200 million for the CGIAR. And of course, we know that the Gates Foundation agenda is to promote high-yield, so-called high-yield varieties of seeds, which goes along with their package of fertilizers and pesticides. And famously, Gates has a sign that he holds saying, I love fertilizers. And he loves to bandy that about. But there's another thing that we should be very concerned about, which is the rise of market-based finance and carbon offsetting from the food system. So all the terminology a lot of the terminology you hear about regenerative agriculture, the launch of the regenerative landscapes declaration as well, most of that is about carbon offsetting, by which it means that you have agribusinesses like Nestle who are investing in so-called regenerative agriculture, through which they hope to gain carbon offsets from so-called soil-based sequestration, or sometimes from claiming that they are sequestering carbon through things like no-till, which is using more pesticides on the ground. And this is why they're pushing so hard here, agribusinesses and fossil fuel companies, for these Article 6 negotiations, because it links very well with their private agenda on voluntary carbon markets. So it's kind of completely tied up. So what do we want to see? We want to see, obviously, discussions on the food system brought within the multilateral system. We don't want any more voluntary pledges, but by multi-stakeholder organizations, which have corporations and governments going hand in hand, to pledge whatever they want for whatever they want. We want it within the historical dimension of historical responsibility, common but differentiated responsibility, of who needs to reduce when. We need transformation towards agroecology, which respects the rights of small-scale producers and recognizes that there will be no climate justice without peoples on the land. And importantly, we demand grant-based public financing for overall adaptation, loss, and damage. And no more debt-fueling loans and market-based and private finance. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kirtana. We are now open to press for questions. Please share your name and who you are with. And yeah. Right.
Tim Stickings from the National here in the UAE. You mentioned the multilateral negotiations. Can I maybe just get the panel's thoughts on where you think they stand after the first week on the global stocktake? Because the head of the UNFCCC has just been very critical of where the negotiations are. And yeah, your thoughts on what needs to happen in the second week, and just particularly on the issues you've been addressing. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the discussion about food systems is not really present at the moment in the global stocktake, but what we do see is the whole gamut of false solutions being present in the global stocktake, from which I mean anything from hydrogen, green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, carbon markets, it's all in there. And all that links to what we were saying, because of course, CCS is used also by fertilizer companies, and their big thing now is so-called no carbon fertilizers, which is basically fertilizers. You make fossil fuel fertilizers produced, and then they, with green hydrogen or carbon capture and storage. So I think, yeah, we're very worried about that. And of course, we want to see that, we want to see what the other side of it is, of course, the financing side and the historical responsibility side, which I mentioned, which needs to be there in the global stocktake. So I think it's an overall language. There's no particular discussion as far as on food systems. Maybe you can add, but that's what we would want to see happen. Yeah.
I'll just add one sentence to that in the interest of time. There are very strong calls to have sustainable food systems as part of the global stocktake preambular, and that's something that many people are working towards seeing next week. Essentially, we need to see both production and consumption measures recognised, and also recognising the role of agroecology as well. We will see the agricultural negotiations as part of the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work program happening. They won't happen now again until Bonn in the middle of the year. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining the press conference of the Demand Climate Justice Campaign. We're going to be outside for a bit, so come talk to us.